Welcome to Chapter 5, Engaging People of Good Faith and Goodwill. In this chapter, you will learn how to work outside of your own faith tradition, both within the Christian population and with other faiths or with people of no faith at all. We'll also begin to look at not just why we should reach out across faiths, but exactly how to do that, from scripture-based exercises to practical tools and tips. We will also begin to hear from other pastors who have effectively reached out and built relationships and programs with others in their city and community. We believe this is very important because engaging others who believe differently than we do, but who care about the same things that we do, can be a very important way to advance and make progress in the urban environment in your city. We are here with you on this journey, and we welcome you to reach out to us at any time if you need help or assistance.
We have really the great privilege today to talk to somebody that I've gotten to know over this last year, the Reverend Jen Bailey. And to say that I have been impressed would be an absolute understatement. She is a big, wide, generous soul and really has, I think, a lot to talk to us today. And I'll be talking with her about this whole idea of reconciliation. Before we get into our conversation, let me just read a brief introduction of who Jen is. Reverend Jen Bailey is the founder and executive director of Faith Matters Network. Jen is an ordained minister, public theologian, and national leader in the multi-faith movement for justice. Jen is an ordained itinerant elder at the African Methodist Episcopal Church and serves locally on the staff of the Greater Bethel AME Church in Nashville. Her new book is To My Beloveds, Letters on Faith, Race, Loss, and Radical Hope. And I know I, for one, am looking very much forward to getting that book and actually getting it out to the LF network, because I think it's just pitch perfect for the kind of times we're living in. Well, Jen, we've had a number of conversations to date regarding why it is so important to reach across the many divisions that keep us from one another, whether it's religion, race, sexual orientation, political, I mean, you name it. And of course, in past conversations with you in our Town Hall and City's Playground podcast, you have actually helped us a great deal understand how that works. Today, what we want to do is place the accent not so much on why it's important, but how do you actually get it done? And even more specifically, to talk about it from a pastoral perspective. Many that will be participating in the Charity to Change are in pastoral ministry. And so what is it about, the pastoral perspective that maybe adds a kind of value with regard to creating these tables of inclusion, these tables of reconciliation? So with that, let me just start here right at the beginning, Jen. In setting tables of reconciliation, how would you describe the difference when you do it as a pastor versus a community organizer? And it sort of, I guess, maybe begs the question, is there a difference? I would love to hear you just reflect a bit on that.
Thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It's been so wonderful to get to know Yale's community over the past year, and what a gift it has been to hear the witnesses and testimonies of the work that is happening across the world, really.
Oh, thank you.
Wow. As I think about this question of the difference and posture between approaching these questions about how we, I might say, offer radical hospitality and bridge divides from a pastoral perspective versus an organizer perspective, I feel challenged because in some ways, the best pastors are awesome community organizers, and the best community organizers are really good at the arts of ministry. So things like preaching and teaching and deep listening and care. And I think that as I reflect back on my own ministry and experience, I wish I would have learned more through my ministerial training on how to set tables that invite difference. And I'm not sure, as I as I think back through my seminary days and into my denominational ordination process, whether that was necessarily a skill that was cultivated within me, I think I got some good training on how to do conflict resolution, because unfortunately, as many people who are listening in know, our congregations and our sites of worship can be some of the places that most have conflict.
Absolutely. Yeah.
When you're engaging with people, not even people who are so different from one another, but within families, right? Like that it
Yep.
plays out in a pretty active and real way in the way that we do life together congregationally. And so I am thinking about the experience that I've had over the past 4 years, setting tables through a project that I've gotten to share a little bit with you all about, called the People's Supper, and a continuation of that project in North Carolina that we've been up to over the past 2 years, called Disciples of Welcome, where over a period of 24 months, we gathered, about 50 pastors. They were all in the United Methodist Church, serving about 60% of them serving congregations in rural contexts. And the structure of that program was really thinking about this question of what it means to bridge divides, given the deep divisions that are at play in our communities, whether that be across lines of politics or ideology, or in the case of, my beloved kindred in the United Methodist Church, thinking about splitting denominationally over issues of gender and sexuality. And one of the lessons that I think emerged for me was through the story of one of our cohort members, Reverend Benny Oakes, who's a pastor in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. And Benny, through his work in our program and his own vocational call, that really moved and really called by God to build a relationship. Benny is a white United Methodist pastor with a local AME Zion pastor in the same town, Reverend Javen Leach. And they just became, through gathering across tables and sharing meals, they just became brothers. It's interesting about Elizabeth City, North Carolina, as some folks may know, is that back this spring, right after the results in the Derek Chauvin trial, who was indicted and convicted for murdering George Floyd in Minnesota, there was a police shooting in Elizabeth City. And in conversations with both Javen and with Benny, one thing that Benny and Javen said really struck me. And Javen said in a conversation with us, the reason that Elizabeth City didn't blow up post this unarmed shooting of a Black man, in this case by members of the police department, is because we had built trust before tragedy. We've had another colleague, I'm thinking about the Reverend Dr. Teresa Thames, who's at Princeton University in their Office of Religious Life, who's been a wise teacher for us, who said, you can't build a bridge during a flood. And so as I think about what is necessary for us to begin engaging across lines of difference in meaningful ways, one of the things that feels deeply meaningful to me from both the voice of Javen and from Teresa is there's something about reaching out a hand and developing a relationship, not because it's trendy, not because there's something that's blowing up, but out of a sense of authentic and genuine curiosity about one's neighbor. And for me, this is so deeply tied to my own theological disposition, which is if I am on this quest to get to know God better throughout the course of my life, I'll never be fully perfect. I will never see the perfect face of God, right? But I do know that there's a God presence in each of us. And so in getting to know and investing in and being curious enough to have questions with folks I don't know in my community, I'm getting to learn a little bit more about God because there's a God presence in them. And so that is as simple as inviting people out for coffee that you don't know, right? And we're not trained to do that. And so I recognize that can be almost a counterintuitive pulse when you're, as a pastor in particular, taught to shepherd your flock. It's not necessarily the instinct to reach out to the pastor across the street who you might see as competition, or the pastor across town who worships very differently than you do, right?
Yeah, Jen, that's beautifully articulated. And I think you surfaced something that I've wondered about is the pastoral perspective that we do have an effect of faith that says, people are not means to ends, but they are ends in and of themselves.
Mm.
And I've oftentimes thought about something that Thomas Aquinas said, obviously many, many years ago, but he said, in effect, all evil at the end of the day is a confusion of ends and means.
Mm.
And that's always struck me, that particularly in building, I think, these tables of reconciliation, that the pastoral impulse actually is build the table because that's what one should do, rather than that being a means, right, to somehow get this done or get this issue done. And so I love the way you've articulated that. Do you think then within kind of being a pastor, and even though sounds like your training didn't give you the kind of skills maybe that you wished you would have had, are there some skills that you have discovered as you have been building these tables that you find particularly helpful to bring about a table of reconciliation?
Yeah, I think it's really useful, particularly in conversations that I've had here. And, I live in Nashville, Tennessee. We've done people's suppers and convened tables across the Southeast, which, for better or worse, is a whole lot of Christians in the Southeast. And so, for better, I think. I don't know. We don't always act like Christians all the time in this region of the country.
I'm with you on that. That's a tricky one.
Right. But one of the many things and gifts that I think my training has offered me is the ability to speak and translate across difference using a common set of language that is the language of our faith. So I'm thinking in particular about tables that we've convened around hot topics like politics or immigration or even abortion.
Yeah.
And I think being able to serve in that space of table facilitator when I'm guiding a table or conversation, but to be able to identify, particularly in gathering fellow Christians, a common set of language about who we are and what we profess our faith to be has been really useful for me. And I would argue that any good preacher is a really good translator. That part of our work
interesting.
is taking this ancient text, an ancient tradition, and making it relevant for the here and now and today. And that requires a work both of exegesis, so like literally interpreting scriptures, but it also requires a work of translation depending on who it is we're talking to or preaching to. I'd also offer that there's something about the art of pastoral care, of being able to and having the experience of being with people during the best and worst moments of their lives. Whether that's the birth of a new child or the death of a loved one, literally all of the life cycle we get to bear witness to, which means we see the good in people and we can see people when they're not at their best. But we know that anyone on their worst day it's not the full measure of a person.
Yeah.
And I think that opens the door to an ability to empathize, an ability to see nuance and complexity where other people may not. And I don't know if it's just my theological disposition, but I feel this real spiritual mandate not to give up on people. That there is always the opportunity or a pathway to redemption available to people. And so I think that just fundamentally, when I sit at a table that's trying to do this messy work of figuring out how to be human across our differences, leads me to a posture of openness, of receptivity, and a mandate not to give up on folks, even when I really want to, and I often want to, right? That calls me back to my faith and calls me back to what I think one of the messages of the Gospels is, right? We're meant to be in community and communion both with the divine and with one another. And so those are all things that I honestly think is one of the reasons why, especially in the US, but I think this has lessons globally as well, in this moment of deep, deep division and brokenness, I think it's our religious institutions that have really good ways and means and practices of staying in community with one another that are going to help us see us through what to me feels like, yes, a democratic crisis, but more a spiritual crisis. It's a crisis of our nation's soul here in the US. And so I'm really anxious to talk to colleagues from around the world to see if they see these same patterns happening and if there might be antidotes in traditions to help address these ills.
Yeah. You lift up the idea of the text and being a both good exegete and interpreter. One of the other things that I've noticed, and again, I'd love to hear you give more comment about this, but a good exegete is not just a good theologian, but she becomes a good anthropologist as well. Right, which is to say that, yes, we have this high theology, but we have an equally robust kind of anthropology that tells us how humans actually become human. And, in listening to you, I think that's one of the things that comes out, Jan, is that, yes, a grasp on the text as it being theological, but you seem to have a very good understanding about this thing called the human, and how and why and the goods and the bads of it. Can you say a bit more about that? How you become this anthropologist, and you're able to maybe notice people and how they are motivated, not motivated, what brings them to the table, what maybe keeps them back from the table?
Yeah, I think if I reflect back on my own life experience and what it has meant in a variety of contexts for me to be pushed to the margins or to be other. One of the great gifts of being on the margins is that you're at the edge, and so you can see the horizon much more clearly. So I've been growing up in a community of about 40,000 folks in West Central Illinois, where I was, Black folks were about 10% of the population. Not just Black folks, but all Black and brown folks were 10% of the population in my hometown. There was a certain acute awareness for me as a young Black woman growing up in that context of my otherness, which I think allowed me throughout the course of my life, when I observed otherness happening, whether it was otherizing happening, whether that was because of someone's socioeconomic status or religious identity, to have a great deal of empathy for those folks.
Yeah.
And because I was proximate to people whose life stories were very different than my own, I think it empowered me with a way of seeing people not just on the surface of who they are, but to know that there's something deeper behind their stories. So I grew up with a lot of working class white boys who worked the farms, right? And his families worked factories and were pretty blue collar.
Yeah.
And so when I think about those populations that of folks who probably voted very differently than I did in the past couple of elections, rather than otherize and see them as the enemy, as some people might in this moment, because anyone who doesn't believe exactly like you do in this moment is the enemy. And sort of popular imagination, I had names and people and places to put to those bodies and those quote unquote statistics.
Yeah,
and
that's excellent.
That I loved and I knew growing up, and some of them I didn't necessarily love, but I knew and cared about growing up, right?
You bet.
So,
you bet.
I think that it has given me in my life the ability to see people beyond what they might initially present or surface, right? Or the categories people might put people into because of their life, what they know of their life story and experience. Because I've also found that when you ask the questions about people's life experience and what they care about and why, often the answers you get are radically different than the ones that you project onto folks.
Yeah, that's so well said. And, it's actually something that I think you and I had previously talked about, but again, I think this is the pastoral element, that our relationality precedes our rationality. Right. And so often I think, in some of these tables that we're trying to create, we think that there's a rational way to kind of, somehow facilitate it. And while I think there is that element, if we take our eye off the fact that people sit around that table relationally before they become rational, I think we miss an opportunity. And I think that particular pastoral element that I've seen in you as you've talked about how these tables are brought together, it's because you lead with your relationality, and then only later, right, do we begin to talk about the rational side. Another aspect within all this, Jan, is and I want to say this as clearly as I can, but that in reconciliation and putting tables together, there is a spiritual reality to it, right? Mm-hmm. It's not just kind of setting the table and, finding the topic and can't we all just kind of begin to talk about this, but there is a spirituality to it. Can you say a bit about how you have sort of held that reality as you've been, again, building these very real tables that are, human and concrete and all that, but how do you contend or, think about the spiritual element as well?
Yeah, I have two initial responses that come to mind for me. The first is that this work of building tables, whether they be tables of reconciliation or new tables altogether, because part of what we have to be honest about is that in some cases we haven't been in relationships, so there's nothing to reconcile, but it's about a new project, is that it requires a certain degree of spiritual discipline and humility. The discipline to be in the practice of showing up at the table again and again and again, even if you don't get the initial response you want, even if it gets hard, right? There is something about the discipline of being in community that requires us to show up in a particular way and continue showing up, not just for a one-off event, but to begin that process of the deep relationship building that's necessary for social transformation to come about in our communities. And so I would say that requires a certain rigor in individual practice, right? So if I am going to show up at a table that I know I'm going to be with folks who might trigger something within myself or trigger me, I think that there is a responsibility on my part to do some of my spiritual prep work. If that is locking myself in my prayer closet to get in the right mindset, if it is going through the rituals that I know sustain me so that I can show up more fully and with an open heart, by playing some good gospel music before I go into this space, right? Secular music that I also consider gospel, right? As part of, if it's a writing practice, right? I think, so often we cast people into these spaces without encouraging them to lean on the tools and the resources of their own faith tradition. Because in order to engage fully, we have to come with an open heart and an open posture and a willingness to learn and unlearn. And all of that requires discipline. And so I think we talked about this in a previous conversation, the sort of three questions that I always ask or have begun to ask as I think about bridging work or building these tables of reconciliation, as you so poignantly put it. But these questions of like, what are we bridging to, right? What is ultimately our destination that we have in mind together? What are we bridging over? Because in many communities, there's a history and a context and a reason we're in relationship with one another, right? And so rather than bridging over it, how are we paying attention to that river or that stream or that lake or whatever it is that cause people to be separate to begin with? And then there's the question of, what is your bridge made of? Because I don't know about you, but if I'm tackling challenges like endemic intergenerational poverty or racial injustice or domestic violence in my communities, I don't want a bridge made of sticks. I want a bridge made of steel, right? And to me, that the material stuff of which we make up that bridge is in part about building the resources and the skills to be able to engage in these conversations. So that includes some of what I've been sharing about sort of personal processes and practices that
Yeah.
work spiritually. Then there's like just basic conflict management 101, right? There's discipline, and I think there's really an art to this work that we all are learning in real time in this moment. And there's some real rich wisdom from elders who've gone before and examples that have been set for us throughout history of the way that people have shown up for one another and accompanied one another in community that we really can learn from, to help make sure that our bridges are fortified, that they are of steel.
Yeah, you bet. That's great. You know, again, just listening to you, I sense this in you, that one of the tools that I think you have and you probably make great use of, and even to call it a tool in some ways probably, minimizes it a bit, but is the role of forgiveness in putting these tables together. Can you talk a bit about that, particularly when you think about maybe some of these places where you have been marginalized by the table itself, or even betrayed, in your attempt to work? How do you hold on to this idea of forgiveness as a way of keeping a table together?
Yeah, you would think as a pastor I would be more well versed in the art of forgiveness. But what I will say is that forgiveness is something that I'm learning how to do each and every day. Both to be forgiven and to forgive is a practice that I'm learning alongside, like, I hear in the back of my mind real critiques, right, of, language of forgiveness has been deployed against marginalized communities by those people who've oppressed them through a Christian lens for centuries. What I need is accountability. I hear that, I hear that critique, and I honor it, and I think it's right. And accountability plus what to me, right, when wrongs have been. I find myself unwilling to, unless it's the case of someone who has perpetuated such a deep harm or disturbing pattern of behavior and has not gone through the work of being wise enough to ask for forgiveness and then doing that conversion, that turning away from their past patterns. In that case, you have like an abuser on your hands, and welcome to the table until some real transformative work has happened. But I just feel this really nagging sense that we would be so much better if we learned how to wade through the messy, mucky stuff of harm and repair and offering pathways back into community and pathways of redemption to those who have done wrong in community. And that road to repair, and so maybe I'm using the language of repair rather than forgiveness, because or maybe they go hand in hand, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
But I don't know that we're well versed on how to do that, even though we have some good examples in the biblical text of folks who've been in community who've had to forgive, right? In our everyday practice, it feels almost counterintuitive in a culture, I think, in the US at least, that's obsessed with punishment, right? And
completely,
that there's a difference between justice and punishment that is intended to be vindictive in a way. And so all that is my long way of saying is I am learning by doing and by humbly remembering that I myself have caused wounds and I carry scars, and I am someone who has been forgiven, and I have known the joy of that, and as someone who is learning how to forgive, and I've felt the freedom in that, right? My hope is that in this moment, in this time, we actually begin to write down some of these practices and recognize that forgiveness, much like it's Maureen Kaba, an activist who talks about hope as a discipline. I also think forgiveness is a discipline.
I think that's beautifully said. And I think you surfaced something that, at least I know in my own experience, has probably been the most difficult thing. And that is, to forgive others as I have already been forgiven, and to actually rest and relax into that space. And I think there is this direct relationship between my own ability to receive my own forgiveness, right, to turn around and then be able to forgive others. And so it's that interior work, going back to even the spiritual discipline a bit, that I think is very prominent in this place. So I like a lot the way you've said that. The other element that I think I'm learning about this as well, and particularly if you take something like the Lord's Prayer as maybe a framework, one of the things that's always been curious to me is that, in effect, Jesus teaches us how to pray, and almost everything in the Lord's Prayer by way of petition is something that only God can do, right? I mean, the kingdom on earth as it already is in heaven, is a God thing. Daily bread, we're supposed to get that from God. But then it all hinges on, but you need to forgive others, right, the way you've already been forgiven. And I think that sense of how much that is the central work, I think both with regard to our own lives and these tables that we're trying to build, I think really is an interesting element for me, at least to watch it play out. And like you, I very much am aware that there are certain tables that I was only there because of the person's willingness to continue to reach out to me, to hold me in there, even when I didn't want to be there. So I like that a lot. Well, kind of in sort of closing up our conversation a little bit here, Jen, I, again, would love to have you maybe even give a bit of a prophetic word of sorts as you're kind of looking out there on the horizon with regard to, again, these churches that will be involved in our Charity to Change program, and they're, again, trying to do good work in their respective city to try to help the city actually become, to use our language, more like God's playground rather than a battleground. What would you have them keep their eye on, or maybe be aware of as they do this work?
What's coming to me is something that has been my own prayer lately, has been navigating some challenges in my personal life, which is that remembering that I serve a God who has a bigger imagination than I do, particularly when it comes to sort of interpersonal relationships or conflict, that I may not see a way out of this, but I believe in a God who can and already is. And so I might say to the congregations that'll be listening in, when the going gets tough, as you're trying to think about what it means to embody this paradigm of shifting the city from a battleground to God's playground, when you feel like your back's against the wall, or maybe your last nerve has been tap danced upon, remembering that we serve a God that sees and imagines and has creative solutions that we can't even name yet, and is already working on our behalf to advance those solutions. And so entering into the space with a posture of both humility and openness to receive that transformation and to receive those visions and to be delighted. I think we don't talk enough these days about the role of delight and joy and surprise and play, all of which I think are a part of God's great big imagination that's bigger than anything we can hope for.
That's a lovely conclusion, Jen. I mean, I know this came up in one of yours in my earlier conversations, but this deep theological idea that our work is always in response to what the Holy Spirit is already doing. And I love that idea. And I think what you just described is that theological truth once again. And like you said, it changes the whole weight, right, of the equation. If you know that it's God that's doing it, and then we respond to what God is doing, rather than us somehow thinking this thing sits on our desk and it all depends on our effort. And that that becomes exhausting and ultimately not sustainable. So, well, Jen, as always the case with you, it has been an absolute pleasure and delight to talk with you. Thank you for your insights and reflections. I think the churches that are going to be involved in this curriculum will be much better equipped to do the kind of work I know they feel like they're being called to as a result of listening to you. So with that, and on behalf of Leadership Foundations and the Charity to Change Initiative, our thanks to you.
Thank you so much, and blessings to the work ahead. Whenever you're listening into this, know that God is with you. All you have to do is pause, take a deep breath, and receive.
Amen.
Well, greetings. Welcome back to Charity to Change. We're in the chapter 5 on engaging leaders of good faith and goodwill. In this chapter, we're learning from experts in their field about how to work outside of their own tradition, both within the Christian population and other faiths, or people with no faith. In order to change systems and move from charity to change, we know we need to work with those systems, which include people of no faith and different faiths, and we need to work collectively with people from other faiths to work towards change. In this lesson, we are joined by Dr. Jeffrey Bailey. Jeff is a friend of Leadership Foundations and has worked with us on many projects, including the development of Charity to Change. Jeff is not only a public policy expert and certified strategic planner, but has also worked in academia on interfaith dialogue and conflict resolution. He got his PhD from Cambridge University, where he also taught and served as the managing director of the Center for Social Justice in London. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and children, and he is the director of strategy at Open Fields. Open Fields is a close friend of Leadership Foundations. They're a social impact consulting firm who are doing really great work with mission-driven organizations across the country. Thanks so much for joining us, Jeff.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Great. Well, in this chapter, as we said, we're diving into not only why we should reach out across faith boundaries, but exactly how, and how to do so while kind of keeping our faith at the center of it, and not taking our Christian hat off as we kind of enter civil society. I want to start by asking you how you got into this work and some of the work you've done.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, really good to be with you all and excited about this curriculum that you're developing and all the different nonprofit and church leaders that are going to be engaging with these kinds of questions. I really got into this, honestly, like so many people, it was a post 9/11 question that rose for me in terms of seeing that the kind of ways in which we assumed the secular settlement was working in Western countries, that when the Twin Towers fell, suddenly everyone woke up to a whole set of religious questions that we thought had been settled in a certain kind of way. And we realized, oh no, religion is not going away. Religion is staying as a kind of front and center issue, that we maybe need some better ways to think about this and talk about this. So that was, for me, an initial kind of motivating question as somebody who was kind of coming of age intellectually and other kinds of ways in that era. And I was also interested in the kind of broader social change of public policy and how folks in cities do collaborative work together, and recognizing that to do that really well means that we've got to reach across sometimes deep differences to find these areas of common ground to work on things that matter to all of us. So that was a real question for me. And honestly, I think what what we've all experienced over the last number of years is that that sense of difference in the U.S. is only growing. It's not going away. We certainly feel that politically, I think, and there's obviously lots of concerns that we have about that. But one of the biggest areas of difference is religious difference, right? In terms of how we approach these questions, and it has implications for how we live and how what families look like and what cities look like. And so the importance of how we navigate that difference, and especially religious difference, I think is only growing in urgency. So that was one of the big motivating areas for me. And I suppose the last thing I'll say with that is what was motivating is a recognition that the way in which religious difference had historically been approached in previous decades felt kind of unsatisfying to religious people who were practitioners. So the kind of classic way of entering in during a certain era of this kind of work was kind of lowest denominator religion, right? This approach that says, oh, yes, there's all these kind of apparent surface differences between Jews and Muslims and Christians and Sikhs and Hindus, but at root, at the base, they're all really saying the same things. They share these, ethical traditions or other kinds of accounts of ultimate reality or these kinds of things. And I think increasingly over time, religious believers would show up to those conversations and say, this doesn't actually feel like this represents my faith in a way that I experience it or engage in it with all of its particularities, all of its rough edges, and all of the truth claims that different faiths feel like they're coming into dialogue and engagement with that feel appear to be incompatible with the truth claims and the universal truth claims of other traditions. And so Jews and Christians and Muslims are not all saying the same thing. And so how would we actually create a model that you can have interfaith engagement in which people can show up as their true selves and not have to park their deepest commitments at the door, but they can come together with all of their traditions and their beliefs and the seeming incompatibility of that, and still engage in genuine dialogue and engagement with each other that moves things forward. So that was, I think, the other real big question for me, and what I took to some of the work that I was doing then at graduate school and the work that we were doing in some of the other models.
And that model that you wrote about is called scriptural reasoning.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that? How does that work in action?
It makes a big difference if different traditions can come together and have a common project together. So if you bring different faiths together and you sort of talk about your different beliefs about, a doctrinal area or a particular, problems or solutions and the way that's solved within that kind of system, you can have some good conversations, but then you only get so far and you kind of understand where each other's coming from. And that's not really a shared project. And so scriptural reasoning is an approach to interfaith engagement that allows that conversation to keep going over an extended period of time, and also to go deeper, both into one's own tradition and to engagement with each other. So the basic approach of scriptural reasoning, which was first developed amongst some Jewish scholars, it was called textual reasoning at that time. And then some Christians, including some of the folks that I was working with at Cambridge, they got involved in kind of listening around the edges, and they got engaged. And then some Muslim friends who were in those circles, they were listening in and saying, is this something, could this be a three-way conversation? And so scriptural reasoning is really a three-way conversation where each tradition comes into around the table, each with their own texts. And very practically speaking, if you were to come to a scriptural reasoning session, you might have 10 to 12 folks with 3 or 4 people from each of the 3 Abrahamic traditions, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And there would be a theme for that conversation. Maybe it's economics, or maybe it's the theme of witness, or family relationships, or any number of different kinds of things. That's the kind of guiding theme. And then texts from the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, and the Quran that relate to that theme. And then over the course of 90 minutes to 2 hours, you spend a certain amount of time studying that question or that theme from each tradition's scriptures. So you would spend time in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible. And of course, that text is authoritative for the Jewish participants who are there, but not, I mean, it's more complicated with Christians, right? But it not in the same way. It functions differently for Christians and certainly for Muslims. And so you're engaging with this text in a way that it's not your own tradition, therefore it's not authoritative for you, but you're trying to understand it on its own terms. And you're all trying to understand that. And then you do that with the Christian scriptures and then with the Quran. And you end up having these fascinating conversations because, of course, you're being asked questions about your texts from people of other faiths, and they're new questions. They're not ones that you've necessarily considered before. And so you're forced to think about that in different ways. And of course, you learn a lot from listening even to other faiths debate their own texts with each other. And so a Muslim who's there at the table might say, well, the text means this. And suddenly his Muslim colleague says, well, actually, there's another reading of this here. And you're listening to them debate between each other. And suddenly you are beginning to access what in scriptural reasoning is called the deep reasonings of a tradition. Getting to the inside, not just at a surface level, but understand what's really going on here. What drives this reading to how you come to this kind of conclusion? And what we found is that when you have those kind of conversations in which you're beginning to understand the deep reasonings of a tradition that's different from your own, you don't come out necessarily agreeing with it. Scriptural reasoning is not about finding consensus, but you do find surprising degrees of solidarity and friendship that emerge when you understand at a deeper level where somebody else is coming from. And the kind of friendship and solidarity and understanding and, interestingly, new insights about their tradition, your own tradition, and the ways in which you engage with each other emerge in ways that can't always be predicted and are sometimes very surprising. And we found that that is not only an interesting model for interfaith dialogue, but maybe it's a model for what dialogue across difference should look like more generally. Maybe that's what our public squares should look like. How do we create public squares in which an intentionality to understand the deeper reasonings of where somebody's coming from doesn't lead to agreement or consensus, but it does actually lead to new forms of friendship and solidarity that you wouldn't have predicted at the outset.
Right. So would you characterize it as a model for disagreement or agreement?
That's a great question, Jonathan. So I'd probably want to resist the categories, right? And say, I don't know that it's about agreement or disagreement. It's about understanding. And it's with the presumption that deeper understanding paves the way for relationship and for friendship and for a kind of solidarity that can actually hold disagreement in a different kind of way when you don't have that kind of depth of insight about each other. And also opens up new possibilities for working together that you wouldn't have predicted at the outset had you not done that deeper work together. So I think it's a means of understanding and going deeper, and I think it's a means of friendship.
So one of the things that strikes me about it, that I like so much about scriptural reasoning, is that it's not watering down.
That's right.
It's not looking for the lowest common denominator and having a kumbaya moment. You're good, I'm good, everybody's good. It actually is. It's a bit of a paradox in that it encourages you to bring your whole self and all of your religious commitments to this public discourse.
Yes.
Talk about that. Why? I mean, that's such an important and different way that we.
No, I think that's right. And I think it has lessons for, the way the public square functions today and the way in which we need new ways of conceiving the way in which that public square works, and working together, kind of work that folks who are listening to this are doing together in cities is a perfect laboratory for doing that kind of work. And what I mean by that is historically, Western liberalism, and I don't mean liberalism in terms of Republican or Democrat, but in the fact that the liberal tradition, we're all liberals about individual rights and a whole set of assumptions about the way things work. That tradition says religious arguments intrinsically lead to conflict. And so it's about trying to protect the public square. We don't let religion in. We only let certain forms of public reasoning come in, forms of reason that, everybody can agree to. And from lots of different spaces, right, that set of assumptions is being questioned. That when you create this kind of, what years ago was called the naked public square, right? We just strip it of all of these kind of comprehensive visions of the good. That's what protects a kind of safe public space. And what we recognize is, that's not true. It just means that non-officially religious viewpoints, but that are still very substantive visions of the good, end up getting smuggled into the public square, but that those who attach those to a kind of formal or traditional religious kind of framework, those views aren't allowed in. And so it ends up being a highly secular kind of context, which disallows massive numbers of people to bring their forms of reasoning into the public square. And again, what 9/11 reminded us is that huge parts of the world that are deeply religious and don't accept those terms, nor should they necessarily. What that does mean, though, is that we need to revisit how we have those conversations. We need to revisit the public square and say, how do we have productive conversations that let people bring in religious forms of reasoning or any form of reasoning that they want, which may or may not win the day, it may or may not convince anybody, but we're trying to find ways in which people show up as religious or non-religious, or whether they're followers of Buddha or Plato or John Stuart Mill or Ralph Waldo Emerson, they can bring those in, but we're not determining upfront what is and isn't allowable as a form of reasoning. So I think it's basically saying we've got more work to do. And in some respects, those who are working in cities in collaborative ways with people of different faiths and no faith, they're on the front lines of this. And you don't actually need all the kind of philosophical apparatus that I'm talking about here to be able to go and do that. But you do need some tools. You do need some frameworks. And that's where scriptural reasoning is so helpful. You can bring people of different faiths together and say, if you know your Bible or your Hebrew Bible or the Quran, and you want to do some of that study now, not just with people of your own faith, but in conversation with others, you're going to have some really rich conversation. You're going to have all kinds of insights, and you're going to actually learn some habits of engagement that carry on beyond just that textual study you're having together. It actually carries on in terms of how we do life together in the public square and for the good of the city.
Let's talk about that for a second. The practical aspect of it. I think a lot of people recognize this kind of bridging differences work and getting to know people of other faiths as important, but not practical. Something you kind of check off the list, saying, yeah, love my neighbor.
Yeah.
Good. But how do you see it working, and how have you seen it working in policy or with development in cities and as nonprofit churches are working across cities?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when it comes to international work and NGO work, there have been people who have done really good work identifying how important it is. Again, Western countries like the United States show up as NGOs with a certain set of secular assumptions and actually don't always know how to navigate with nuance highly religious societies in which parking those religious commitments to the side is not how things are done. And so I think there's some kind of practical training if we're thinking about, for example, international relations, but even thinking about cities. It's interesting. There was a set of studies done in the UK a number of years ago that looked at the impact of various riots that were happening in different eras in cities, whether those be motivated by race relations or economic conditions or any number of different kinds of things. And the study was able to find that those cities in which clergy or people of faith from different traditions had done lots of work together. And there were different reasons that motivated that, right? In those histories, in those cities in which they said, we can't wait until a crisis hits. We need to actually be proactive about building relationships with each other, getting together for food and for meals and for friendship and for study together and doing these kinds of work. When they did the study that when these riots broke out in various kinds of cities, those cities in which clergy or other people of faith had been meeting together, developing relationships, working on common projects together, all of these kinds of things, the impact of the rioting was significantly less. There were measurable and statistical differences in those locations around the country where that kind of work had been done by people of different faiths, building those relationships together. Now, that's the sort of thing that you can't do that overnight. You can't see conflict coming down the horizon and then suddenly scramble to try and build friendship and equity that's not there. That's the kind of work that is slow work over time that you do for its own sake, right? For the joy and the common good that it brings in that moment. But you also know that you're laying groundwork for who knows what comes down the way. But there's no predicting when that comes or if it comes, and that's not the ultimate point, but it does make a huge difference. But again, it's slow work. If you look at it just on the ground, it's like, what comes out of just a group of people from different faiths sitting around a table with their traditions texts in front of them, talking about various kinds of topics, and doing that, every so often, every month or so over the course of time. It looks very small if you're looking at it on the ground. But I would argue that it's those small practices that are actually potentially the most powerful. We like the grand gestures, right? We like the top-down approaches. We like to come in with huge policies and tons of money. And it's not to say that those things don't have their place. They do. But the small practices, the very local practices in cities and towns and, in coffee shops and in synagogues and mosques and churches and basements and small group living rooms, those are often the biggest threads for weaving together something that's really powerful in a city. But most of it's below the radar until it matters, until you're looking at what's needed in a place. And if those things aren't already there, it can't be manufactured. It's why leadership foundations, the work of leadership foundations is so important, because the folks who are working in cities where there's an LF presence, they've been doing this work. And I think some of this interfaith work is work that probably many of them have been doing already. But there's additional practices that can be brought on as well to even extend that further.
That's great. It's all about relationships.
That's right.
I always say, and this is, I love the idea that it's really built on friendship. And it is those small acts of friendship and neighborliness that develop and get you not only closer to your neighbor, but closer to God as you.
Well, that's right. And that's the interesting thing, I think, is, some folks from their faith tradition, they want to be faithful to their tradition. And so the question is, sometimes there's concerns understandably raised of, is this going to make me less sure of my own faith, or, somehow a less faithful practitioner? And what's interesting in scriptural reasoning that we saw again and again as it was practiced in different contexts, not just in academic context, but we brought it to schools. And so you had faith-based schools. This is what I was in England working with. So Jewish and Christian and Muslim schools beginning to come and do this together. We took it to prisons. And so folks in prison from different faiths were beginning to do some scriptural reasoning kinds of things together. And what was interesting is, and in some ways the paradox was, new forms of friendship and solidarity were forming in those conversations. And at the same time, the kinds of questions that you get asked in those contexts, it actually drives you deeper into your own faith. You get asked things that feel easy to answer when you're with people who just believe like you do. But when you're asked by somebody in a genuine way, what to you would have been non-intuitive questions, it actually opens you up in your own faith in a deeper way, and it drives you actually deeper into study and to prayer, and to engaging that much more with your own tradition. So it does have this kind of paradoxical effect of greater solidarity and also greater particularity and greater depth and commitment to your own tradition.
Yeah, it's a Bible study. I mean,
it is.
Yeah.
Yep. It's a Bible study. It means that doing it this way opens up the practice to those parts of our traditions that historically don't necessarily show up for interfaith conversation. And so, speaking in my own Christian tradition, for those that are from evangelical or especially Bible-based parts of the church. The Christian church it's a big tent, right? But for those who, especially for whom Scripture is central, who understand themselves as Bible-based and conservative, it means that you're not asking them to come and just have like philosophical interfaith debates at this kind of high level. It's saying, come and just do what you love to do anyway. Come and study the Bible. There's going to be other folks engaging with you in this that maybe historically haven't been in your Bible study. But it actually creates a way, and this is of course true, what's true for Christians is true within the Jewish and Muslim traditions as well. There's different parts of those traditions in which the textual study of it and the centrality of the text actually makes it that much more accessible to those who maybe historically have not been engaged on the interfaith front. And I think that makes it actually really exciting and promising.
Yeah. So what would you say to churches, a lot of the churches that are currently watching this and working through this curriculum have relationships because of their work in the city.
Yeah.
They have relationships with mosques and synagogues and people of other faiths and no faith. And
yeah.
What would you suggest is for them, some that don't, or those that maybe have just started relationships or kind of surface level relationships, what would you suggest is kind of first steps to going a little bit deeper, even pre-scriptural reasoning, just kind of getting to know people and develop?
Yeah. No, that's a good question, Jonathan. Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any substitute for, just the traditional forms and practices of friendship, right? And for making friends. And so meals together and coffee together. And I think, as it's in the kind of leadership foundation space, as well as others that are doing collective impact or collaborative work, there's the saying that projects like this move at the speed of trust, right? And the speed of trust is what it is in any given context. Sometimes that moves really quickly, sometimes that's slower. But I think those practices of friendship, and then in time beginning to show up in each other's space in some fashion or another, and coming in just with curiosity and not viewing each other as projects for anything other than just through the lens of friendship and wanting to understand. Laying that kind of groundwork, I think, is really important. When it comes to the point where they think, we'd like to really experiment with this idea of scriptural reasoning, then there's resources out there. And so if they Google scriptural reasoning on the internet, they're going to find lots of things pop up that kind of lay out a kind of step-by-step process where you show up and, okay, here we are. We've got our text with us. What do we do now? There's kind of introductory on-ramps into that practice. And so, but you're right. It's not where most people are going to start. It's making sure that we've got some trust here where we can say to somebody, hey, here's a way I would love for us to be able to understand the way in which we approach the world in deeper ways, and to deepen the work that we're doing together. Here's a way to do this.
Yeah, and I mean, the issue of trust is so important, and we know that there's research on trust that one of the key factors in trust is repeat interactions. And
that's right.
Of future repeat interactions. So just getting out and beginning to do that is so crucial.
That's right.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff, for your time and for sharing with this group of pastors and lay leaders and coaches working in cities. I think this has been a really rich time and is going to lead to some great discussions and engagement with people of different faiths. We really appreciate it.
Super. Yeah, love being with you, Jonathan. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, it's good to be with our Charity to Change group again. And today we're with Dr. Stacy Spencer, who's the founding pastor of New Direction Christian Church here in Memphis, Tennessee. Also with a church, a multi-site congregation with churches in Collierville, Tennessee, just to the east of Memphis, as well as in South Africa. Dr. Spencer is born, raised in Kentucky, graduated with his bachelor's degree from Western Kentucky University, has a doctorate of ministry from Drew University, and your Master of Divinity from Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. Author of the book U-Turn, a 12-step guide to spiritual transformation, which is to help people experience a deeper and more fulfilling relationship with Jesus. Stacy is a real trailblazer here in Memphis, not only in this community, but in our whole city. And we'll be talking a little bit about that. He has been married to Rhonda for a number of years. I'm not sure, at least 30.
28.
28. I got you by a few years, yeah, brother. And has four wonderful sons. So we're just delighted to be with Stacy today as we talk about the idea of how you engage a community, how you engage a city, and how you engage people that are different and come from different backgrounds if you're really going to love a community. So why don't you start, Dr. Spencer, by telling us a little bit about New Direction, how you started this thing that's now a mega church with thousands of members when you started with just a handful 20 years ago.
Thank you so much, Larry, for being here, letting me be here with you, and thank you all for tuning in. It's kind of full circle for me and you to be sitting here because you're really a part of my narrative and how I began urban ministry. When I was called here in 1995 to be the youth pastor of Mississippi Boulevard, I inherited a ministry that was pretty much focused around church kids. But I had been doing some studying about urban ministry, and really that's what I worked on with my doctor, my D-man from Drew, was how to do urban ministry in a traditional church. And so we set out with a ministry called JAM, Jesus and Me, and we hit two primary communities surrounding our church, a community called New Chicago and a community called Dixie Homes, both of them impoverished. One was vice lords, one was gangster disciple. And I got educated real quick that it might not be a good idea to bring both those sets of kids in. But as I was trying to figure all of that out, I felt sort of overwhelmed until I heard that Memphis Leadership Foundation had a grant to put youth pastors, youth workers in churches. And so we were able to get 2 interns who helped us to reach out more effectively to Dixie Homes in New Chicago, and that came from your organization. And so that same kind of mindset followed me to when I started this church in 2001. In around 2000, Frank Thomas, the pastor then of Mississippi Boulevard, asked me would I be interested in starting a church in Hickory Hill. Hickory Hill was one of the most rapidly changing communities at that time. Whites were moving out, blacks and Latinos were moving in. The average age was around 26, and here I am 33, and the church that wanted us to start here was a older white congregation with 12 members left, and they said, listen, if you all can come here and plant a church, we will give you our property. They gave us a 200-seat sanctuary on 7 acres of land, and we started with 60 families and grew exponentially in that decade. And so we set out to be an extension of what I did in youth ministry, and that is to reach the young people. Here I was 33, and you draw who you are. So we were reaching young people in the community, and like I said, it just grew more than we could have imagined. And we also set about to do community outreach. We knocked on doors. We asked people what was needed in the community. We wanted to scratch people where they were itching. So we actually had conversations in neighborhoods, in the marketplace. We also found out that there was a drug dealer-backed nightclub right across the street from us where an 18-year-old was shot and paralyzed. And so we marched around that nightclub and shut it down. And so that really set the foundation for how we approach ministry in Hickory Hill. We got a lot of people that were right here in this community. I never will forget the first day we opened our church. We didn't have enough room for people to come in, so we drilled a hole in the wall, put the speaker out on the grass, and people in the apartment community were leaning out their window listening to the gospel. And so we're very intentional about trying to reach the people in our community.
So also, I think I remember you saying that you also would put flyers on cars inviting the church at the strip clubs and the nightclubs, and people would come from those places too. How were they received?
They were received because we created a culture where we wanted those type of people to come. We wanted the people that didn't darken the door frames of other churches. They would not go in because they wouldn't feel accepted. But we had a culture where we dressed casual, we had very contemporary service, and people just felt the love and the unconditional love and support when they came in. So the easy part was putting the flyer on the card. That wasn't hard because we knew we had a church that people would immediately feel embraced.
So let's shift a little bit. You've loved this community. You've learned how to parse it with their needs and the strengths, and you've been able to build on the interest of others by listening in your community. But you've also now embraced the city in a way that is very unique. And I know the pastors in our program are wanting to know how they can make a difference in the bigger context of the city, not only in their community, but the city. So several years ago, a young African-American unarmed man was killed by police in front of the first church where you had the 200-seat arena. So tell us about that and what happened after that.
Yeah, so Darius Stewart, 19, was pulled over for a traffic stop. I believe a tail light was out or something. And the police officer discovered he had a warrant for his arrest. And in the process of him detaining him, Darius got away from the officer, ran away, and as he was running away, he shot him in the back and killed him. And it was such a disturbing occurrence that we wanted to come together as a community. Especially, it happened on our church property. It happened on our youth campus. And so people are looking at me like, so what are you going to do about this? And so we gathered with some other like-minded pastors who are concerned about violence in our community, violence from police and from people in the community. And so we had United Against Violence, a coalition of pastors that we started. But what really took us to the next level was when a group called Noah came to Memphis. Nashville organized around hope. And they came and asked us, would we be interested in starting another Gamaliel affiliated organization? And so it was 6 of us in the basement, and it was Rabbi Greenstein, Reverend Walter Henry from St. James AME, and some other ministers sitting at the table. And we said, yes, sign us up. And so we began to meet every week, but we would invite people from other faiths, because Gamaliel's philosophy is that the only way you can get power is through numbers, and it's an interfaith effort. So we want Christians, Jews, and Muslims, because after all, we're all children of Abraham. We got the same daddy. We got the same self-interest.
We're all cousins.
We're all cousins, right? And so we came up with 3 task force under the new name Memphis Interfaith Coalition for Action and Hope, MICA. Micah 6:8 says, what does God require of thee, O man? But to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And so we want, Micah was a prophet who spoke out against corrupt business owners who were oppressing poor people in Jerusalem. And so we wanted to take that same mantle from Micah and Dr. King to fight for poor people and to fight for inequity. And we came up with 3 task forces: educational equity, economic equity, and racial equity. And out of that, we have about 70 organizations, which are Christians, Jews, Muslims, Catholics, labor unions, parachurch organizations, and we meet on a monthly basis. And our whole goal is to hold elected officials accountable for what they said they're going to do for the people who elected them.
So this is be interesting to hear your take on this, because pastors are supposed to preach the gospel on Sunday, lead a prayer meeting maybe on Wednesday night, teach. What are you doing with this citywide effort with people of other faiths, of no faith, people of goodwill, of good faith, trying to seek these 3 issues, or address these 3 issues with elected officials? Pastor, why aren't you helping us here?
Yeah, that has been a train of thought in people who have been raised in a traditional setting, that the gospel is separate from social justice. But through maturity and enlightenment, we discovered that the social justice and the gospel are the same thing. For example, when Jesus says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to heal the sick, to set the captives free, that to me is social justice. Affordable health care, heal the sick, set the captives free, criminal justice reform, good news to the poor, economic relief. And so it was me being intentional about teaching the congregation what a holistic gospel looked like. That it's not just Sunday morning, it's not just Wednesday. We're a 7-day-a-week church. We are in this community to be stewards over the needs of the people in the community, right? We're supposed to be light on the hill, salt on the earth. Salt ain't no good if it doesn't come out the box. And so we had to come out of the box and get into our community and find out what the community needed so we could meet those needs.
So as you engaged in Micah with this citywide movement, how did you prepare the congregation, and to what degree is the congregation involved in Micah? I think you have quite a few people involved. So how did you prepare them for that? That's the next leap, the church, 4 walls, outside the 4 walls, as you know, Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria. How did you give us some practical ways that you began to move the congregation to have that sort of DNA?
Yeah. Speaking of DNA, when we started the church, we looked at Tom Bandy's book, Moving Beyond the Map, and he set about to help churches establish their vision, their mission, their beliefs, their values. So once you get those things established, you build on that. So we never had to vote on vision at New Direction because it was set in our DNA that we were going to reach the unreached, that we were going to be about social justice. So it's always been a part of our DNA, And so it wasn't a hard fight, but still it was necessary for me as a pastor to paint the vision. I had to preach it, I had to teach it, I had to model it. And so it eventually got into our bloodstream. And we have probably about, on the Micah executive team, probably 3 people are from New Direction. And whenever we have our public meeting, which we have annually, New Direction has the most members from any other organization present. So our people are on fire about a holistic gospel and social justice.
So, speaking of Micah, as a pastor, but working in this multi-faith, interfaith, people of no faith, I assume folks, LGBTQ community as well, because they obviously have been impacted by injustice and racial tension. How do you navigate these different traditions in a way that brings a unified front?
Sure. You know, it's self-interest. You know, there are people who are selfless that people walk over them. There are people who are selfish, who only think about themselves. But each human being has a self-interest, and that is something that they're passionate about, where their values are centered around. And so what we try to do in Micah is to find out what self-interests we all have that we could work on together. And again, we narrowed those down to education, economics, and race. And so there was, at the time that we formed Micah, it was right at the beginning of Trump's election. And there was this vitriol and xenophobia and racism that just got stirred up. And so it caused all of us to come together and say, what are we going to do about domestic terrorism? What are we going to do about police brutality? What are we going to do about Memphis still being one of the most impoverished cities in the nation? And what are we going to do about black people in Memphis who still make 50% less than their white counterparts? And so all of those things we begin to wrestle with, immigration, and it's centered around those self-interests. So if I had to boil it down, I'd say self-interest.
And it's interesting that you didn't try to do everything.
Right.
But those 3 areas, the broader community said these are the things that we all can get on board with.
Let me say something about that process. So we had a very democratic process where we had a list of about 12 issues.
I remember.
You remember that? So we had an issues convention where we went down to Lindenwood Christian Church, and all of our delegates gathered together and we voted on what were the 3 most important issues. But again, it was democratic. Everybody was heard, and then everybody came together to decide what the 3 focus areas were. Because we can't do everything, but if we can narrow our focus and have a laser beam focus, I believe we can get some stuff done.
So you did, yeah, I think we did some group voting, how to get down to those 3. Would you be open to any of our listeners to give you a call to see how you did that, or to?
Yeah. You can also go to micahmemphis.org and check out our website, and you can email us, and we'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
I went to that very first meeting at Lindenwood. There were several hundred people there. Mm-hmm. They were interested, and I was saying, how in the world is Stacy going to get down to what we're going to focus on? Because there were 18, 20 different ideas, from immigration reform to criminal justice reform, and it was amazing to watch that process and how it got narrowed down to those 3 issues. It was I still mesmerized by how that was done. So you've talked about these 3 issues, and of course it involves politicians and government and the mayors and the city. In Memphis we have county government, city government usually at odds with each other. How has the power structure received Micah's influence?
I would say it's been mixed. So there's been some people who, like our county commissioners, who've been very supportive to say, yes, we're glad that you want to help raise money to refurbish our transit system from MATA, and we were able to get them to commit $10 million, something they had never done before. because of this powerful coalition.
And that's an economic issue.
Yes,
it's
economic
not
issue.
about transit. It's about economic.
Because if poor people can't get to work, they can't make a living,
That's right.
And so that was one of the extension of our economic issue. We also met with First Horizon because of their being caught redlining, and they were supposed to redistribute $4.9 billion back into Tennessee. And so we're still trying to walk with them in terms of getting that done. We had to meet with the mayor. We had a demonstration out in front of the mayor's office after George Floyd was murdered, lynched. We came down and there was a list of things that we nailed. This was our 99 thesis. This is our thesis, like Martin Luther's thesis he nailed to Gutenberg the door. And so we put that notice on the fence in front of the mayor's office saying these are the things that we need to make Memphis a more equitable city. And so we've still been working with his administration, or trying to work with his administration, but he doesn't like seeing us come around that much. But we still love him, and we want to make sure that our city officials live up to what they say they're going to do. They were elected by the people, and Micah's only aim is to amplify the voices of the people to make sure that the people are heard.
So why don't you, if you wouldn't mind, giving us a few highlights that have come out of Micah, some results from your coalition.
So we've been able to get some money earmarked for MATA. We were able to get the sheriff's department to depopulate some of their facilities of nonviolent offenders when the coronavirus hit. So they responded well to that. We've been able to help garner more voters through our voter alliance. And like I said, we partner with First Horizon Bank to make sure that that money gets distributed into 6 pilot communities that we identified in Memphis as impoverished communities that need help. So it's been things like that have given us traction and given us hope that we can change the narrative in our city.
So this is just fascinating what you've been able to do. I'm just wondering, it took sort of a disruption for you to kind of embrace this citywide vision? It was Darius who was murdered or shot by police. That was sort of the lightning rod. I remember calling you, I think, a few days after that to see, since it was on your property, I said, Stacy, what's going on?
Right.
And that's when that was the disruption, as it were. That does it always take a disruption for a pastor to take on a task like you did, or would you have eventually gotten to that place anyway?
I think it takes a disruption. I think it takes Gabriel to come into a rudimentary priestly duty and shock Zechariah and tell him that your wife who is barren is going to have a baby. I think it takes the shock of us seeing young people shot down on our church property. There's a plethora of things we see, right? But how are we going to respond to that? You know what I mean? What are we going to do when we see it? Because it's not enough to see it. And we have people all the time, oh, the community's changed. Oh, my God, the young people are leaving the church. But what is the response of the church to the stuff you see? And so when I saw it, I saw some stuff I couldn't unsee. And it disturbed my sleep. It disturbed my peace in a good way, because it gave me righteous indignation to go out and do something about the tragedies that I saw in my own community and city.
So it was a way of seeing that caused this righteous indignation. You'd been seeing it before, and every pastor in this program has seen similar issues. But it's easy to get overwhelmed, isn't it? To say, what can we really do? Let's just preach a good sermon on Sunday.
You know, the thing is, Larry, we need to know that we can't do everything, but we can do something.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like that book, Simple Church, where it says you have to narrow down what your vision and mission is into 3 easy things. And our 3 things at our church is to empower all people to know God, to allow people to experience God in worship, and to engage the community through missions and social justice. So New Direction narrowed our scope of what we were called to do to 3 things. I think every church, if they can just find 3 things that they can focus on and do those 3 things well, I believe God's going to say, well done. Mm-hmm. You were faithful over
3 things. That's right. So you've mentioned 3 books. Name that book again.
That book is A Simple Church. I think it's by Thomas Rainer.
Okay.
He's also the same guy who did the Revitalized Church and the Autopsy of a Dead Church. The Externally Focused Church is a good book. And the third one will come back to me later. My 53 years of living.
Sometime tonight, huh? Well, this has been a rich conversation. Before we close out, is any last words you want to leave with our 150 pastors that we'll be working with over the next 3 years?
Yes, sir. Let me look into the camera and address my brothers and sisters. Listen, I'm so excited that y'all are here gathering information from practitioners and people who've been out on the battlefield like yourself. And I just want to ask you this question. What would it look like if every church in your city empowered its block, adopted its block, engaged the block? What would it look like to have workforce development in every church where people are taught trades so they can make a living wage? What would it look like to adopt a school, adopt your neighborhood school and make sure that kids' literacy rates go up and make sure kids have breakfast before they go to school? What would it look like for you to do affordable housing through your own CDC? It would look like the kingdom of God. It would look like God's will being done on earth as it is in heaven. And so I just applaud you. I'm praying for you that you would continue to be salt of the earth and light on the hill and change the narrative in your city.
Thank you, Dr. Spencer. Let me pray for us. God, thank you for this rich time with Dr. Spencer, New Direction, for the amazing witness that this church has been, not only to the Hickory Hill community, but to the city of Memphis. Thank you for the courageous steps that Dr. Spencer and his people have taken to really embrace this community in a holistic way. We give you praise and thank you for what you are doing and will do in Hickory Hill and in Memphis through New Direction. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.
Thank you, my brother. Appreciate you.
Yeah.